Hello, I'm here. Wait just 1 second because I have yet another failure of YouTube to deal with. You see, last night I created a live stream on my phone in the YouTube app, and now it turns out that that stream does not synchronize with the website YouTube, which means that I now have to start all over, which is not a big deal. But of course, if people were waiting in the other stream, then they now have to join this stream. But this is one of the many failures of YouTube. Having said that, hello, you all. We're back here again, aren't we? Yeah. How's everybody doing? We always have to make allowance for the slight delay, too. If you are going to end your hobby with a pen, what pen would that be? I mean, like, kill myself with a pen? Or do we mean purchase a pen and then call it quits? I'm not sure. I feel really quite content with what I have. So I don't know if there would be one particular pen that would really be the be all end all, so to speak, of pens. I don't know if I have one that would do that, to be honest. Looking to buying a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. My preferred nib size is a Western medium. Should I buy Sailor medium, medium fine, or broad? I would say a Sailor broad would be a safe bet. The Sailor medium is more likely to write like a fine, and the MF, the medium fine, somewhere in between. I think if you really like Western mediums, then that would be a pretty good option. Yeah. I'm well so far. Oh, look, it's Gourmet Pens. Hello, Gourmet Pens. I've read that studies indicate that students retain more info from handwritten notes than typed notes. Yes, I think that is, as far as we can ever say that, I think that is true. At the very least, I think that is supported by quite a bit of evidence. And there are different reasons you could come up with for that. One might be that you use more motor skill as you write as opposed to just typing. And you also tend to write a little bit more deliberately so than when you type. You have to make effort of what to write. And then there is also an effect along the lines of, if someone is talking, you're trying to write, then you cannot write down verbatim everything they say. Whereas with typing, if you are a fast typer, then sometimes you can. So it's the selection process of thinking about what you do have to write down and what you don't write down. In other words, what is and what is not important, that makes the selection, and that also already makes you think about the material. And then as a result, you may remember that material better. So I think that is true. That handwriting may help you remember something better. Yes. Which one is your must-have fountain pen? I don't know if I have one that really outweighs every other pen I own. There are a few that I really like. But I don't necessarily think that there is one that is the absolute best and that outweighs all others, to be honest. As a follower of Stoicism, what do you think about detachment? How detached are you from your emotions, objects, fellow humans? I think a certain level of detachment is healthy and wise. I think too much detachment becomes a bad thing, but then it is too much. I think trying to step back and think about what's going on and what's happening in your life is an important thing. In the same way that trying to take a step back from your emotions when they happen, and think about whether they are good emotions, useful emotions, or whether it's something that is not very useful at that time, can be very helpful. What is the most expensive fountain pen you broke trying to disassemble? A long time ago. This is really a long time ago. I hadn't been into fountain pens for very long. And I bought a vintage Montblanc 22. And I was trying to get the piston out. And at that point, I was used to nudeless pen pistons, which you can just take out, but you keep unscrewing the knob, and then at some point the piston pops out. It turns out that if you do that with a Montblanc, the piston rod just snaps in half. Now I know. These are expensive lessons, yes. Is spirituality just a linguistic mumbo-jumbo that you trick people with nonsensic vocabulary, or is it something you have experienced? I think that really depends on how you define spirituality. If spirituality is deeply religious, divine experiences, then no, I cannot say I've ever experienced that. If it is anything else, then of course, potentially so, yes. I don't know, again, that would depend a bit on your definition of what you consider spirituality. I think a lot of spirituality, or things that people describe as spirituality, like for example, very new agey type beliefs, are not really founded in anything. But on the other hand, if spirituality for you is for example, a sense of enjoyment of certain things, like for example, enjoyment of nature is often described, that people really enjoy being in nature. And I think that can also be a very spiritual experience. I don't think it always has to be a religious thing or a very vague or peculiar thing. I think it can also be smaller, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Your views on afterlife. Well, although I would much like to believe in an afterlife, I just don't think I can. I have tried, but it doesn't really work for me. And there are implications of that, of course. But I just don't really see that happening on all kinds of, in my mind, fairly solid scientific grounds. So I always struggle with that. I don't really see that, no, happening, really. Perhaps the better question is, which one is a must get or purchase as soon as possible, as in pens, right? Because I think that's what we were talking about. That I really don't know, because that really depends on what you're looking for. I mean, there are hundreds of fountain pens out there, so I cannot say this is the one pen that you should buy. That depends on your needs, desires, what you like in a pen, what type of filling mechanism, what type of material, what type of nib material, what your budget is, where you will write with it, what ink capacity you need. So I really don't know what the one pen is to buy. I just don't know. Have you thought about putting a third-party nib on your conid, such as Sailor King of Pen nib? I have considered it, but then I also realized that the Konet nib is actually really nice. So I don't really have that need. I know a friend here at the Calgary Pen Club has put a Danny Trio nib on it, which is a very nice nib because it looks very pretty. So for the aesthetic, you could do that. But again, if the Konet nib is fine, it's quite an operation to actually make that work because of the way the pen is constructed and the nib color, all that stuff. So I don't know. I don't really have that need. You've mentioned you don't want to go down the watch collecting rabbit hole, but if money wasn't a problem, what other hobbies might you be interested in? Yeah, I don't know. I am fairly happy with the things I am doing, and I don't necessarily see anything that I would really love to pursue, but that I am at this point not really pursuing. So I think I'm fairly happy with the hobbies that I have and that I am. What do you do with a hobby? Doing that I am doing, I think. What are books that you are currently reading? I am right now reading The End of Everything, which is a book on astrophysics and how the universe may end according to different theories, which was a gift from a dear friend. And that's a depressing gift, isn't it, when you think about it? Anyway, it's an interesting book. Yeah, I've only made it. I think I'm only at chapter 4 now. But it's an interesting book. It's well written. I find that kind of stuff interesting. So that's what I'm reading. I'm also reading a textbook in cognitive neuroscience because I wanted to read that. You sometimes have to explore different options and see what kind of textbook you might want to teach from. And I'm not sure if I really like the textbook that we're using now. So I'm exploring alternatives. We never see the rest of what you're wearing. Yeah, it's. I'm afraid it's just a pair of jeans. It's nothing. It's nothing exotic. I'm sorry. Is there any books that have gone over your head that you felt too hard to read? Probably. I have recently read a whole bunch of what do you call it? Like installments. There is a series from, and I'm really struggling now because I'm wondering if it's Oxford or Cambridge. I want to say Oxford, called Very Short Introductions, very small books, and that's what they are, very short introductions to all kinds of topics. Because there were a couple of things that I wanted to read up on, and I found that with those books, so this is stuff kind of definitely out of my field of expertise, like thermodynamics or physics or nuclear physics or what else did I read? But all of these, chemistry, for example, but these are all things that somehow tie into the teaching that I do, although I don't have to go into much detail on these things, of course. So I wanted to read it. And what I found interesting was that there was a rather large variation in how legible those books were, because these are typically something like 115 pages, maybe 140 pages, but that's it. So they're very short books that try to illustrate and try to introduce really complicated topics. And some authors can do that very well. They can break down something that's very complicated into a very short text. But others, it seemed, even though they are clearly at the top of their field, because all these books are written by full professors of different places and such, emeritus professors, but some really seem to struggle with breaking down complicated topics for such a broad audience, which I found interesting to see that there was so much variation in that. Coffee or tea? The answer for me is always tea. Do you watch much TV? If so, what is your favorite show? I actually don't own a TV. I know this is a shocking thing in this day and age, but I have not owned a TV for years, and I am surprisingly happy with this, actually. Yeah. Retractable nibs seem like interesting engineering. Thoughts, pro, con, issues to be aware of. Yeah, I don't really have a need for retractable nibs, but I can imagine that if you are in a profession where you have to do a lot of things single-handedly, that could be very helpful. I'm not in such a profession. I always have time to uncap a pen. So I think there is a great pragmatism to those pens if you need it. But if you don't, then the question arises of what does this add? Again, I know of people. One friend is a chef and he uses one. If there are other jobs where you really typically only have one hand available, then that can be very helpful. But if not, then what is a retractable nib but a gimmick? I mean, yeah, I suppose it's convenient, but I've never understood how, if you are not in a profession where one of your hands is occupied, or of course, but I don't think this applies to many of us, or of course you only have one hand, which also happens, or you cannot use one hand or anything like that. But if that is not the case, then what do you really gain by having a retractable nib fountain pen? You just have more moving parts that can also break. And so I've never really been I've owned some. I've never really been a fan. I've had the Lamy Dialogue 3. I've had the Pilot Vanishing Point, the Decimo, and I don't really get it, I must say. Having said that, so that there are obvious benefits, you can operate it single-handedly, which could be a benefit to you. But I also find that one issue is drying out of the nib. And that is something I've experienced with a couple of these. Typically, there is some sort of mechanism that slides in front of or down or whatever, like of the nib. But I haven't actually. I have experienced that those nibs can dry out, and that's a problem. It may also depend a bit on the type of ink you use, but that is an issue, which again makes me think, if you don't need it, I don't really see the use for it, to be honest. Oh, I was scrolled. I got into tea partially thanks to you. I'm watching this live while sipping a mug of Biomudan BOY tea. Well, it's good, nice. How do you deal with stress and anxiety about the future? Yeah, with difficulty sometimes, because it's hard. And I think life is hard. It's hard to be alive. It's hard to live. Having said that, I think there are certain things that you can try to do to live with stress. One of the things for me has been to try to approach those things from the perspective of Stoicism, for example. How often to clean a pen if not changing the ink? I don't think there are rules necessarily. Like it's not if you don't do it 3 times, you only do it 2 times, your pen will break. I think it would also depend a little bit on the ink. If it's a washable blue ink, well, those inks are so neutral and so, I kind of want to say weak. That sounds like a negative. I don't mean it as a negative, but I mean it's such a light liquid that I really don't think that would do much damage. If on the other hand, so in that case, I think you could potentially go multiple inkings up. I think that's the word, without cleaning your pen. If on the other hand, it's an iron gall ink, then maybe you do want to clean the pen every single time after use, even though you ink it up with the exact same ink again, simply because those inks are a bit more, well, one could say aggressive, but are a bit more difficult than a washable blue would be. Those are extremes. If you're talking about inks with shimmer in them, if you're talking about incredibly sheening inks, I would also clean the pens more often. Now that in my mind is the spectrum. On the one hand, there's washable blue. On the other hand, there is the shimmer, maybe sheeny, the iron gall inks, and I think most inks will be somewhere in between. Where? That depends on the ink. There's nothing wrong with cleaning a pen every single time you re-ink it. And that way you can be, in my mind, absolutely sure that nothing will happen because you have cleaned the pen. Typically, that's what I do. Even if I know that I have a pen that I kind of always use with the same ink, I still try to clean it when it's dry, just to make sure nothing dries up, or even I assume that you would re-ink it straight away. But if you were to put a pen away, then I would definitely clean it. Yeah, otherwise I just clean it again too, just to be sure. Yeah. Do you think happiness is a feeling that one uses to trick oneself as an escapist mechanism? I don't necessarily think so, but I do think there are certain things that we do that we use to minimize cognitive dissonance. I think there are certain things that we do where we say, well, I've invested so much time or effort into this must be why I'm doing that. And that I think that is a thing, yes. I also think you can really be happy. It's a different thing if you think you're happy while in reality you're not. But that's always the challenge, right? Of figuring out what really makes you happy and what does not, I think. Nice. Is there a restaurant involved at the end of everything? Yes. Yes. And they play Jaws 3 times an hour too. Yeah. Nice. Nice, nice, nice. What else do we have? Mini Roger is still still evolving, huh? Yeah. Yes, yes. I still look forward to seeing him. Ankara pens. Do you have any experience with them? No. I'm just thinking, I don't think I've never owned one, that is certain. I don't think, no, I think I may have used someone else's at some point. Not in a review. That was a nice pen. But I don't own any. Never been into tea before, but tried some lapsang after you talked about it on one of these. Now it's creeping into my mornings instead of coffee. Yes, you see? This is how it is. This is how these things evolve. I find a vanishing point very helpful when shopping, where you often have just one hand free and also don't want to have to handle a cap while handling goods. Yeah, that makes sense. I think these are the types of situations where people use them. Yeah, yeah. Even though you are not a fan of the Parkour 51, will you review the new version when it comes out? Potentially. It will depend a little bit. I wouldn't purchase it. So if anyone sends me one, then I would be happy to review it. But it's not a pen I would buy, simply because I have no interest in owning it, right? So, but I will reach out to some people because it would be interesting to review it, I think, and check it out at least. Yeah. I love wet, juicy, ultra smooth nibs, giant size pen. Suggest me one pen that I can use for the rest of my life. Money is not a problem. Namiki Emperor. I think that meets all the criteria. It's very big, it has a large ink capacity, and it has a smooth nib. How many fountain pens have you bought this year? What brand? I have bought I'm just thinking this year I've bought one pen. It's a Conway Stewart. I don't have it yet. The rest were not bought this year. OB6 was paid before then. No, I think that's it. Yeah, no, I think that's it. One. Conway Stewart. I love the idea of vintage fountain pens, but I find the sections on most of them to be too narrow for my grip. Do you have any recommendations for vintage pens with larger sections? You can always take duct tape, wrap it around it, and make it fat, and then you can write with it anytime you want. But if that is not an option, there are larger fountain pens that are vintage. The only problem I have found with the really like the actually bigger vintage pens, I mean, you wouldn't find a lot of vintage pens the size of modern massive oversized pens unless you're going for that. I always forget the model. Is it the 94? Probably not. There's a really big Waterman, which is really huge. There are other larger vintage fountain pens. At some point, I was going through one of Andy Lambrew's books, Fountain Pens of the World, maybe. One of the advantages of his book is that many of the pens are reproduced life size. So if you look at the picture, you can see how big the pen is, which is really neat, and I think also partially explains the price of those books. I made notes of some of the larger vintage pens that I thought I would check out, and all of those were $1,500 and upwards. So the problem with, now I'm not saying that applies to all vintage larger vintage fountain pens, but I think a lot of them are very expensive and get very expensive. And that's another reason I don't do vintage pens. I cannot comfortably write with a tiny pen that just doesn't work for me, right? And for many people it does, but for me it does not. So I can't give you a very concrete answer beyond they exist. You can do some research because they exist. There undoubtedly are threads about this on Fountain Pen Network. I find it hard to believe there would not be. There are bigger vintage pens, but often they become quite expensive. There even is I just talk about this for just a second because I found it fascinating. There is a vintage Montegrappa pen, which I found fascinating, which was just described by Andy Lambrew, I think, as the Jumbo or something, which is a very humble pen, relatively speaking, because I think it was plastic and it had a steel nib, but it's 8 inches. So it's a big pen and very wide, but it's almost impossible to find anywhere. There are some threads on that pen online, but actually for sale, I haven't found it, which is interesting. I'm not for retractable nibs, says Ellen, but some people find them fun, and that should be enough for them to. Oh yeah, absolutely. And I wasn't trying to suggest that you shouldn't. I mean, it's just not. I don't have the use for it really. No, and that's a fair point that she makes. Let's face it. We write with fountain pens because we enjoy them, not exactly in need. No, this is true. This is true. And I mean, I'm also. I mean, if you do want to use a retractable pen, that's fine. It's just that for me, out of sheer pragmatism, I've not found a need for that type of pen. All right. How are nib sizes determined? For instance, why is a number 5 a number 5 nib? Are, say, all number 5 nibs interchangeable? That is an excellent question. And that is one to which there actually is an objective answer. Nib size is determined by the diameter of the feed. So a number 5 nib goes on a feed that is 5 millimeters in diameter. A number 6 nib on a feed that is 6 millimeters in diameter, and a number 8 nib on a feed that is 8 millimeters in diameter. Then there is the somewhat obscure number 7 nib, which you don't see that often. And that one I've only seen on Oldwin. That's the only brand I've seen that had a number 7 nib. So it's very simple. If you can take the feed of the pen out and you can measure with a pair of calipers the diameter of the feed, right? Then you know exactly what nib type it is. I did at some point on my website, but you would have to look for it. You'd have to Google it. I did do a very quick drawing. It's not really a video. It's just a very short written post with a terrible hand-drawn illustration of, I think, number 5 versus number 6 nibs and what the different dimensions are. But the number, again, refers to the diameter of the feed. Now, then the second part of this question is also super interesting. So are all number X nibs interchangeable? The answer to that, in my mind, is no, they are not. You might expect that, but no. The reason for that, I can try to show you. The reason for that, sorry for the noise, let's unzip that. Just for the record, my dear Carol, I was just unzipping this, okay? It's not my pants, just so you know. Now, different nib manufacturers have different shapes of nibs. So think about it. You could have 2 number 6 nibs, which both have a feed diameter that's 6 millimeters, but one nib may be only curved a little bit and the other nib may be curved a lot more, so may curve around the feed more. And that means that you cannot always interchange nibs. So the 2 big manufacturing companies, Bock and Jovo, actually have nibs that are shaped slightly differently, and that's what I wanted to show you. So here and here, I guess. No, you know what? I'm just going to show you the conid and something else because I think that's a good comparison. So here you have, this is a Bock, I'm sorry, I didn't have my loop here, but this is a Bock number 8 nib, okay? I know you can't see all the details, but just look at the general shape of this nib. Now here, I have a Jovo number 8 nib, which I think they stopped producing. So now at the top, you have the Bock, and at the bottom, you have the Jovo nib. And as you can see, they're both number 8. Feed diameter is 8 millimeters in both cases, but they're a very different shape. The Jovo nib is wider, right? It's just like the shoulders are wider, and it's stockier. It's a little shorter. So these you cannot interchange. Even though they're both number 8 nibs, I cannot take this nib and feed out and put it in that nib and feed color or something. I can't. So there you have it. I hope that was a satisfactory answer, but I felt that was actually an answer with a question with a factual answer that I could actually give you a straight, clear answer to. Then the final thing I'll say, then there are some nib manufacturers that make nibs that are in between sizes. So for example, Fountain Pen Revolution comes to mind. You can buy a 5.5 nib. So that's 5.5 millimeter feed, right? So that's just a little, that's not exactly number 5. It's not exactly number 6, something in between. I hope that helps. Has there ever been a time that a nib has been too broad for you to use? It can happen. And it's a matter of what's your purpose, I think. Like for example, Aziza has this Montblanc music nib, which is super wide, and that's a beautiful nib. But for everyday writing, that may not be perfect. If your everyday writing is filling out forms, and you could do that with a fountain pen, then that's not the right nib. I have not really struggled, but for example, the cross point nib on the LB5, I love that pen and I love that nib, but for really everyday writing, that is almost too broad. I use that when I make notes for headers and such, and you can write beautiful notes with it, but if I would have to write someone a letter with that, I don't know, you would have something like 50 words on the page and the page is full. So that some nibs can be too broad, but it depends a bit on your purpose. If you do Asian calligraphy, for example, with a cross point nib, and you do it somewhat bigger with characters, then I could see how that would work very well. Have you ever written with a nib that wrote well, but otherwise disgusted you? No, I don't think so. I also don't know if nibs have ever really disgusted me. but there have been some unpleasant nibs. I have used, for example, really cheap, I can't even call that inexpensive, but some really cheap Indian pens that had nibs that were so rigid and so scratchy that they were unpleasant to write with. I wouldn't say necessarily I was disgusted by them, but they were unpleasant to write with. And I think if they would evoke a negative sense in me, then there would be nibs that just don't write well. So I don't think I would be disgusted by anything, but also have a nib that writes well. I think it has to be both or none. Good morning from California. I enjoy the pictures from your hikes. Are some of the peaks already snow-capped? I couldn't make out if it was snow or ice when the pictures you shared were just a lie. No, there are some peaks that still have snow on them. I don't believe we've had snowfall yet, but there are some peaks that already have snow on them, or actually that still have snow on them, that never really molten/melted. I still have discussions about that with people, about the conjugation of the verb. But yes. Do you have any pen pals? I do, but there was a time I probably corresponded with about 35 people or so. And although that is a lot of fun, I simply do not have time for that anymore. So realistically, I think there was only one person that I still correspond with. And that's just because of time limitations. I don't have time, and I often feel bad because I get the request from people quite a lot if they can ask me a letter. And I often say you can, but I cannot guarantee you get something in return, which is sad. But like, again, don't forget that the pen stuff is something I do on top of a full-time job, on top of a family life, and I just don't have the time. So the answer is yes, but not to a lot of people. The follow-up question was, maybe my question should have been, do you write letters? That, yes, I do write letters, yes. Waterman 20, yeah, that could be it. That could have been that really big one. I always forget which number it is. I know that those two are very expensive, often depending on the state, but usually are quite expensive. Yeah. There's the another suggestion is the vintage Schaefer PFM. Yeah, that's a bigger one as well. But not, I think, the size of a huge modern oversized pen, but they are indeed girthier. Yeah. All right. Yeah, Ellen says, and this is true. Like my tiny hand do come at an advantage when dealing with vintage pens. Yes, that's the thing. A lot of vintage pens were smaller, which at that time was just a normal pen size. I think we've just come to expect, some of us come to expect larger pens. I'm not saying that that's reasonable or valid, but it's just the way that has grown to be. And 7 feet. We have tall people. So as to Dutch people, I'm not that huge. Interesting, isn't it? Anyway, what else? With vintage pens, would writing with your hand farther back in the barrel and post-it might be a better writing experience? Potentially, if you can. I mean, I'm also not trying to suggest that vintage pens are all sort of microscopic devices. It's not necessarily that. I mean, if you buy, for example, a vest pen, well, then it is smaller because it's supposed to go in a vest pocket. So you can't, like, it's the same as a modern pocket pen. They don't always post, and sometimes I'm also a bit hesitant to post such a pen because the material may have become a little fragile, and I don't necessarily want to put strain on the cap. I suppose that if you can, sure, that would resolve the issue, but then there's also still, and that to me is the bigger issue, the thinness of those pens. They are often quite thin, have very narrow, skinny sections, which I suppose was considered comfortable at that point in time. Well, it's not very comfortable to me. And again, this is completely personal, right? I mean, many people love vintage pens. I already start off at the point where I don't really love vintage pens, and then they're also not very comfortable for me to use most of the time. So then it's just kind of like it becomes a lose-lose situation, right? Okay. Have you ever thought of comparing line width of different nibs with like a Sharpie? The idea being that anyone can get a sense of how much the line width of an expensive width. Oh yeah, that's an interesting idea. I could, yes, I could consider something like that. Yeah, yeah. I try to use paper that has a grid, so that typically those are 5 by 5 millimeters, so you have a bit of an idea. But that's not a bad idea. Yeah. Be a while before that would be implemented, because I have a bunch of videos already lined up. That's a good idea. Thank you. All right. How do you separate between what you need and what you want, generally speaking? That's a complicated question. I think that is one that starts with a lot of self-reflection and trying to figure out, first of all, what the difference is between the two. What are things that you absolutely cannot be without, and what are things that you could potentially be without, but you would rather not be without? I think if you can make that distinction, then that will become easier to work with and process. Is there an episode 1 of the Pierre and Steven show? Yes. Kiara is right. It is on Instagram. We did the first one as a live Instagram stream. It's not on YouTube. What else do we have? Yeah, that's a good thing to add, because of our earlier discussion about nib sizes. Pilot nib sizes are whack. The Namiki Emperor does not have a 50 millimeter feet, but it does have a number 50 nib. I've always assumed, but I haven't actually measured it, that in those cases refers to the length of the nibs, because the Namiki Emperor does have a very long, it's a really big nib. So I've always thought, but I've not measured it, so this could be completely wrong. It could also be a random number they've chosen, but I always thought that about 5 centimeters, that looks about right. But I haven't checked it. Yes. What else? 2 years of daily use of my Pilot Metropolitan, dozens of capping and uncapping. The cap doesn't stay in place. Is there a snap cap pen that can survive a lifetime and has a wet and consistent flow? Yeah, I'm sure there is. I think the Lamy Safaris are actually very robust in that regard. This is the problem with a snap cap, right? It is a mechanism that potentially could wear out. So Lamy Safari, I don't think is a bad one. I think some of the Parkers and Watermans are maybe not the most spectacular designs, but they are affordable, and they typically write pretty well, I think. Yeah. How do Leonardo and Pen BBS compare? Well, I mean, Pen BBS is kind of a mass-produced Chinese brand. Leonardo is a handmade Italian brand. So in that regard, they are quite different. Doug Rathbun on YouTube has done a side-by-side comparison of, I think he has at least, but I'm pretty sure he has, of the Moonman M8, yes, M800, I want to say, and Leonardo, which is basically the Moonman is a copy of the Leonardo. And I'm pretty sure that Tom from Goldspot Pens has done the same thing too on YouTube. So if you really want to see them side by side, you can. I mean, this is always a complicated discussion, because at the end of the day, yeah, they're two swirly plastic pens. Yeah, that's just the way it is. But in my mind, one is handmade, one is mass-produced, and there is a difference in the way that feels to me. Does that warrant the massive price difference? Yeah, that gets into a fairly philosophical discussion, I always feel. But that's pretty much it. Like I think that's it. Yeah. So watch those guys' videos, because they really compare them side by side, and also point out what the real differences are in feeling and weight, etc. I haven't used one of those Chinese copies of the Leonardo, so I don't know. I'm sure they're nice pens, but yeah, I haven't seen them side by side personally. What are your thoughts about the Elia Note A5 notebook? I'm pretty sure I've reviewed it, Elia Note, and I liked it. I thought it was a very comfortable notebook to use, so you can always check out the review. What else? I recently acquired an OMAS 361, beautiful writing from both sides. Why is such a concept not continued by other brands? I don't know. There are some who do. There was the Hero 360, which was a lot cheaper and had a nib that wrote under any angle. I don't know if it's still in production. There are some people who do. There was a Kickstarter a while ago that had pens that nibs that would write on both sides. So it is done, I think. But the question is, do you need a pen that has a nib that writes on all sides, or do you just write the pen how it was meant to be used, right? Like, I mean, I'm not trying to be offensive or anything, but like if I have this pen, I just grabbed this because it was within arm's length, and it's meant to write with like this, what does it add to me if I can also write with it like this? Then you may as well use a ballpoint, because it does that, right? Then you don't have to spend all the money on a fountain pen. But that's just my thoughts. Like, I mean, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I don't necessarily see the value added to having a nib that I can write with under any angle. I have a Furore with a Bock nib unit. Ink starvation occurs after about a page of writing. What is the most likely cause of this? I wouldn't say it's the ink. It's typically the air exchange. And what you could try to do is use a cartridge, just because it's a standard international cartridge would fit. If that solves the problem, then it might be the converter. And then you could try to fit in another converter, see if that works. If none of that solves the issue, then it's something in the feed. And fixing that yourself is not that easy. You can, but then you really need to know what you're doing. I'm not one of those people. So if I have that issue, then I typically go to a nibmeister or a friend who does know what they're doing, and they can typically sort that out. Hello from Germany. Leonardo confirmed the release of Furore Grande. Would you buy it if it cost as much as the Momento Zero Grande? I would definitely consider it. I really like the size of that pen, and I think the Grande size for a Furore would be very interesting. And I would definitely check that out. Yeah. Yeah. Why the chat is not available in older videos? I would like to know what they are about. Yeah, it's not my doing. This gets uploaded by YouTube, and I don't have any influence over what is or is not included. So if YouTube does not include the chat, then the chat is gone, and there's nothing I can do about it. What else? I mean, sorry, but like it's not like I have an option that I have to click or something. It just gets uploaded automatically to YouTube. Oh, that's interesting. Jenny says, it seems the program device you use to stream may have an impact on whether or not the live comments are shown later. Yeah, that's possible. And it's, again, I will check. I have never seen an option along the lines of save the comments for later, but maybe I've just missed something. I'll check. Is Parker 21 and Parker Duofold Junior orange hard rubber circa 1920-30 worth buying? If you're willing to spend the money on it, I think it's worth buying. I don't see why it would not be worth buying. They're classic pens. It depends a bit on what you want. If you want to become a millionaire, then it's probably not worth it, because I don't think those pens are going to increase that much in value that will happen. If you're just looking for fun pens to use, I think these are great pens that you can have a lot of fun with. Yeah. I particularly enjoy this, and I have to read it out loud. Could you list all your favorite types of tea, or will that take a long time? Nice. My favorite tea is Assam, and sometimes a blend that has Assam in it. But I really, really like Assam, so it didn't take a long time. That was a good one, though. Yeah. What else? I fixed a bent nib yesterday. I bought a Parker 75 on eBay that had a nib that was bent down. I got my surgical instruments and bent it back up. It writes very well now, but it's kind of ugly. Yeah, it's not necessarily easy to work on nibs. Like, it is hard, and it's a lot harder than it seems. And you can also do damage to nibs, which is not some sort of personal attack or something, but yeah, it's hard. It's hard, and it's not an easy thing to do always. Do Schaefer watermelon inks have any expiration? Yes, I think any ink really has an expiration date, but I don't know what it is. And some inks have been around for a long time and people still use them and they're fine. Other inks have been around for a short time and something happens to them, and you cannot use them anymore. So I can't say, well, it has to be 3 months, you have to use it up, but I do typically caution people against buying so much ink that you can't use it up, because at some point it may indeed do go off. Yeah. What do you think about the new Montblanc Victor Hugo? I don't know if I've seen it yet. I have to check it out. Sorry. Thoughts on Myers-Briggs versus birth order and the effect on personality? Yes, I think in a previous episode we have discussed the Myers-Briggs questionnaire quite extensively. Birth order, yeah, I don't know if there's any real evidence to suggest that there is an effect. I mean, I can imagine that there would be an effect simply because being the oldest child, the youngest child, puts you in a specific sort of slot within a family. I don't know if, so I think it is more something like that the way your parents then treat you, you are treated by siblings, that may influence your personality, than that there is a magical effect, like some sort of, I'm not saying that you say that, but like some sort of like horoscope effect that would then affect how you lead your life, and your entire personality is shaped by that. I think it's more the effect of being in that specific order in your family, and as a result, experiencing things in a certain way. Have you experienced hard starts with obliques? If yes, what is the reason for this to happen? I think it's the same as with any nib, except an oblique requires a specific angle to use. So if you're not using the proper angle, it will hard start all the time. Do you ever go sit and write just for the fun of writing with your pens? Yes, absolutely. I do. I do actually do that. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. What else? I'm only doing 5 more minutes today because I have another appointment after this. So today we don't have the full 2 hours. Sorry, but it's the way the cookie crumbles today. You are right. Of course I am. I did try a cartridge to solve my ink starvation issue and it seems to be working. So please explain Eric's change to us. Well, think about it. A fountain pen has an ink reservoir, and as ink is flowing out of the pen, that space created by the ink leaving the nib has to be replaced by something. And given the like the universe we're in, that something is air, right? Air will take up the space that's freed up by that ink. But if that does not happen, if ink flows out of the nib, but air cannot flow back into the, like through the feed, that's why it has specific channels for that, into the ink reservoir, then what you get is a vacuum. And if a vacuum is drawn, no more ink will come out because it can't get out, right? So theoretically, the solution would be to fix that issue. One solution is to use a different converter. It's possible that the converter doesn't fit properly on the nipple in the section, and that as a result, that air exchange is hampered, or that air is just leaking out somewhere, that the fit isn't good, for example, or that there's a bigger issue, that the channels on the feed are inadequate to put air back into the ink reservoir. I don't know if that was a clear explanation, but something along those lines. So a nibmeister will know exactly what to do. They know exactly what channels to make deeper or adjust in any way. And then you should not have that issue anymore. But it could be something like that. I have this with my old Win. It came with a Waterman converter. If I put that in, it just stops writing after about half a page or so. And if I use a simple Waterman cartridge, which I refill with ink, it writes indefinitely until the cartridge runs dry. So I think in that case, it's not something in the feed, because then it would always do that. I think it's just the fit with the converter that isn't perfect and that somehow disrupts the ink flow. I hope that helps. Can tipping material be added to a gold nib that's been worn down? Yep, absolutely. But you need a specialized person who can do that. And I've mentioned him a couple of times. I'm sure there are other people. I just mentioned him because he has done this for me and it has worked. Greg Minuskin, Minuskin, in California. Trained watchmaker, knows how to handle tiny things very well. And he will just take off the old tipping and weld on new tipping with, there's a name for that, a micro welder or laser welder. He has some sort of specialized equipment. And he can do it. Of course, you pay for the service. But the advantage is you can, within reason, get the nib width that you want, because he just uses more or less tipping. So if that was a fine nib, it's worn down, but you really wanted it to be a broad, he could just put on broad tipping. And then all of a sudden, boom, as it were. All right. We seem to have covered most of the questions. So that's actually excellent. I will be here, I think, again next week. This was only 1 hour, but again, I have an appointment after this. Thank you all for being here. I always have fun with these. And I will repeat what I always say. For those people who say, or who ask me, what can I do to support you? Well, there is patreon.com/SBREBROWN, where you could financially support my videos. You don't have to, because I also love you if you don't. But if you feel like there is something that you would want to do as some sort of support mechanism, there is always that. And you're by no means obliged to do so. There we have it. I hope this was useful. I hope you had fun. And I'll see you again soon. What do we have tomorrow? What thing do we have tomorrow? Ah, yes. Oh, tomorrow's an interesting review. Coming up then. All right. Until then, stay safe. Have fun. Bye.